My neighbor poisoned my garden to win the community competition. When I confronted her, she said, "You can't compete with me." But my final move made her the laughing stock of the neighborhood. I've been living in this quiet little suburb outside of Atlanta for almost 20 years, tending to my own corner of peace. I'm not the kind of person to seek out trouble or even competition, really. But I will say this, my garden is my pride and joy. In fact, it's my only joy these days. After my husband passed a few years ago, I threw myself into it even more. It's where I feel most connected, most alive, well, myself. Every morning, with the sun just starting to filter through the trees, I'm out there with my hands in the dirt, pruning roses, checking the tomatoes, talking to my pumpkin vines like they're old friends. My neighbors know I take the annual Best Garden in the Neighborhood competition seriously. It's small potatoes, really, just a ribbon and a little recognition from the local community center, but it means something to me. Not because I need to win, because I haven't, not once in all these years, but because it's a kind of affirmation that my little garden matters. So when I heard Evelyn Pickett was moving in next door, I was just happy to have someone new around. I didn't think she'd care about a silly garden contest. But, oh, I was wrong. Evelyn moved in with more flair than anyone I'd ever seen, and it was clear from day one that she wanted people to notice her. She had a sleek, expensive SUV that shined as if it had been polished by angels. She wore wide-brimmed sun hats with matching gloves, her hair always perfect. I saw her first standing on her front porch, hands on her hips, surveying her property like she was a queen taking in her kingdom. I chuckled to myself, thinking she was just a little dramatic, but then I noticed she was eyeing my garden with this look. Like she was already judging it. One morning, I decided to be friendly, walked over, and extended a warm hand, soil-stained and all. "Hey there, Evelyn, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Mary Ann," I said. Evelyn took my hand, barely shaking it before quickly letting go, almost like she didn't want to get too close. "Oh, hi. Mary Ann, was it?" she said with that kind of polite smile that felt hollow. "Nice garden you have there." "Thank you," I replied, feeling oddly self-conscious. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she looked at my tomatoes. "It's quaint," she said. "Rustic, really." I forced a smile. I like to keep things natural. A little wild, but it works. She tilted her head, like she was processing the concept. "Yes, I can see that." "Well, I have big plans for my yard," she said, almost challenging me with her stare. "Something bold, unique." "Oh, I'd be happy to share some of my heirloom roses with you. They're really special, from my grandmother's garden," I offered. I'd never met someone who didn't love those roses. Evelyn barely glanced at them, giving a small, dismissive wave of her hand. "That's sweet, but I'm looking for something grander. You know?" There was something about her tone, like she was pitying me. I swallowed down the little sting of irritation. "Well, if you change your mind, they're there," I said, shrugging. For weeks after that, I watched her parade around her yard with her landscapers, ordering around workers who carted in load after load of plants, fountains, trellises, you name it. It seemed excessive, but I told myself she was just excited about her new home. The truth is, I was a little hurt by how she'd dismissed my roses, but I tried not to take it personally. I even convinced myself that she'd come around. Little did I know I'd just met my gardening nemesis. One Sunday morning, I went outside with my coffee to check on my plants. I had a batch of prize tomatoes I'd been nurturing since last spring, their leaves full and green, and my lavender bushes were blooming like crazy. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. Yellow spots. All over the tomatoes. And my lavender. It was wilting. "No, no, no," I muttered, inspecting each plant. "Pests?" I thought, frowning. I'd been careful about that, but I went ahead and sprayed them down. The next day, the tomatoes looked worse. A few of the fruits were rotting right on the vine. And the lavender? Brown and shriveled. By the end of the week, my roses started showing signs, their petals curling at the edges, their bright colors fading. I was baffled, angry, and, yes, heartbroken. My garden was falling apart right before the competition. One morning, I caught Evelyn lingering by my yard with a smirk that just screamed, "I know something you don't." "Morning, Evelyn," I called out, walking over, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "Oh, hi there, Mary Ann," she said, doing her best to sound friendly. "You know, I couldn't help but notice your garden's been struggling lately. It's such a shame." I felt my hands clench. Yes, it's strange. They were thriving just last week. Evelyn looked at me with this little glint in her eye. "Oh, that's gardening for you, isn't it? So unpredictable." She smiled, almost too wide, and sauntered off. I thought about it all day. There was something in the way she'd said it, something that twisted my gut with suspicion. So I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I bought a small camera and hid it in one of my birdhouses, angled right toward my garden. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, and my hands went cold. There she was, sneaking into my yard in the dead of night, holding a spray bottle and spritzing my plants, one by one, with something I couldn't identify but just knew, was poison. My heart pounded. She's sabotaging my garden, I whispered, anger boiling up, but I knew confronting her right away would only lead to a denial. I needed a plan. The next day, I invited my neighbor, Tom, over for coffee. Tom's one of those no-nonsense types, the kind of guy who knows everyone and keeps an eye on the neighborhood. Tom, I said, lowering my voice after showing him the footage. What do you think? Tom shook his head. Mary Ann, that's downright criminal. She's a piece of work, that one. What are you gonna do? I took a deep breath. I have an idea. But it's a little unconventional. Over the next week, I replaced every dying plant with lifelike plastic ones. I ordered high-quality artificial roses, tomatoes, lavender, even a couple of pumpkins, and carefully installed them, making sure they looked exactly like the real thing. I positioned them to catch Evelyn's eye, hoping she'd take the bait. Then, the night before the competition, Evelyn struck again. I watched her through my front window, clutching her spray bottle with a gleeful little grin as she sprayed my plants liberally, dousing them in whatever toxic mix she thought would give her the upper hand. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Part of me was angry enough to go out and confront her right then and there, but the other part knew patience would be sweeter. I could already picture the scene in my head, the look on her face when she realized she'd lost. The next morning, everyone gathered for the judging. Evelyn hovered nearby, throwing smug glances my way as the judges walked through her yard, then made their way to mine. My heart pounded as they inspected each plant, exclaiming over the vibrant roses, marveling at my resilient tomatoes. My neighbors clapped and nodded approvingly, and I caught Evelyn's face, tight with barely concealed frustration. "Oh, Mary Ann," one of the judges said, smiling wide. "Your garden is simply stunning this year. We've never seen tomatoes this healthy. And those roses, flawless." "Thank you," I said, smiling. "It took a lot of care." Evelyn, unable to hold back any longer, strode over, her face red with frustration. "Care? That's not care. Those can't possibly be real." She pointed at my garden, nearly shouting. "I mean, look at them. They're too perfect." The crowd went quiet, everyone watching her with raised eyebrows. One of the judges, Mrs. Peters, looked at Evelyn, frowning. "Are you saying you think Mary Ann cheated?" "I'm just saying it's odd, isn't it?" Evelyn snapped, her voice shrill. "Those tomatoes. No one's tomatoes look that good." Mrs. Peters straightened her glasses and looked back at me. "Well, I'm afraid that sounds more like sour grapes than gardening knowledge, Evelyn." The crowd chuckled, and Evelyn's face turned beet red. She huffed, gave me one last murderous look, and stormed off back to her yard. The judges awarded me Most Resilient Garden, a new category they said was inspired by my determination to save my plants. I accepted the ribbon with a polite smile, feeling a thrill of victory not just for the title but for the fact that Evelyn's plan had backfired in the most satisfying way. Later that afternoon, Tom sauntered over, grinning ear to ear. "Well, Mary Ann, I think you won the battle fair and square. Evelyn's been skulking around, barely looking anyone in the eye. Word spreads fast in this neighborhood." I laughed, the tension from weeks of sabotage and secrecy finally melting away. "I think she learned her lesson. Sometimes it pays to take the high road. Or the plastic one." Evelyn didn't speak to me again after that. She became something of an outsider in the neighborhood, her reputation as the garden saboteur firmly set. The next spring, she sold her house and moved out, and peace returned to the neighborhood. I went back to real plants soon after that. But I left one plastic rose in my garden, hidden but visible if you looked closely, a little reminder of the garden wars, and a silent trophy of the time I beat Evelyn Pickett at her own game. A few weeks passed after the competition, and life settled back into its usual rhythm. I didn't hear much from or about Evelyn. She kept her distance, and I kept my distance. But I could still feel her eyes on me sometimes, like this lingering resentment that wouldn't quite let go. I didn't pay her much mind. After all, I had my garden back to its real, living glory, and each day brought new blossoms and fresh tomatoes. One Saturday morning, I was out watering my beds when Evelyn's door swung open, and she marched across the lawn toward me. I hadn't seen her up close since the day of the competition, and something about her look unsettled me. Her face was tight, lips pressed together as if she'd been stewing on something for days. "Mary Ann," she called out sharply, barely making an effort to keep her voice pleasant. I turned, keeping my watering can steady. "Good morning, Evelyn." She crossed her arms and looked me up and down, a mixture of anger and desperation in her eyes. I just wanted to let you know that I'm putting my house on the market. This neighborhood isn't what I thought it would be." There was a bitterness in her voice that was almost laughable. She glared at me, as if blaming me for everything that had gone wrong. I gave her a small nod, trying to stay polite. "I'm sorry to hear that, Evelyn. I hope you find a place that suits you better. Oh, I will, she snapped, almost like a threat. Somewhere where people know how to respect their neighbors, where things aren't just so provincial. I bit my tongue, holding back the things I wanted to say. Instead, I took a deep breath and managed a small smile. I wish you all the best, Evelyn. I'm sure you'll find exactly what you're looking for. She scoffed, gave me one last icy look, and turned back to her house. I watched her walk away, wondering how someone could be so angry over something as simple as a garden competition. But I was relieved. The thought of her moving out brought a surprising sense of peace. The next few weeks were quiet. I saw the for sale sign go up in her yard, and every once in a while, a car would pull up with prospective buyers. I'd wave to them, smiling and thinking how different things might be with a new neighbor who actually cared about the community and, ideally, didn't harbor any deep-seated vendettas over potted plants. One evening, after I'd finished up in the garden, Tom stopped by. He had a small bottle of homemade cider, his usual peace offering whenever he had news. "Mary Ann," he started, grinning as he handed me the bottle. "Did you hear? Evelyn accepted an offer. She'll be out by the end of the month." "Thank God for that," I muttered, laughing as I took the cider. "I'll finally be able to tend to my roses in peace." Tom laughed and leaned in a little closer, dropping his voice. "But you know the best part?" "What's that?" I asked, intrigued. "Turns out she didn't make a single penny off the sale. She's leaving with less than what she put in." My eyes widened. "You're kidding." He nodded, chuckling. Apparently, word about her little garden antics spread farther than she thought. Guess buyers didn't like the idea of moving into the house of a garden saboteur. Can't say I'm surprised. I couldn't hold back the laugh that burst out of me. All that scheming, all that energy she'd put into trying to sabotage me, and it had come back to bite her. "Well," I said, smiling, "I suppose there's a little justice in that." As the weeks passed, Evelyn's belongings slowly disappeared. The garden she'd spent so much money on began to wilt, neglected and overgrown as she focused on packing. By the time she finally moved out, her once perfect yard looked like an afterthought, a ghost of the manicured paradise she'd tried to create. A few days after she'd gone, I was out in my garden, carefully pruning my roses, when a young couple walked up to the house next door. They had a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, who stared in awe at my garden, tugging on her mother's sleeve and pointing at the roses. I looked over and smiled. "Hello there." The mother smiled back, waving. "Hi. We're the new neighbors, just moved in this morning." "Oh, it's lovely to meet you," I said, setting down my pruners and wiping my hands on my apron. "I'm Mary Ann. I live right here, and if you need anything at all, just let me know." The little girl looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Are those real flowers?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "They sure are," I said, kneeling down to her level. "Would you like to smell them?" She nodded enthusiastically, and I picked one of my roses, holding it out to her. She buried her nose in it, her eyes lighting up. "Wow. Mommy, it smells so good." Her mother smiled and mouthed, "Thank you," and as they walked back to their house, I felt a deep sense of contentment settle over me. It was a fresh start, a new chapter with people who, hopefully, would bring warmth and kindness to the neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, I became friends with the new family. The mother, Julia, loved gardening too, and sometimes she and her daughter would come over to help me plant bulbs or pick fresh tomatoes. It was peaceful, like the drama of the past year had never happened. But every once in a while, I'd catch sight of that one plastic rose hidden among the real ones, a small, silent reminder of the garden wars and the woman who'd gone to such lengths to prove a point. I'd chuckle to myself, remembering how Evelyn's obsession with winning had been her own undoing. In the end, my garden was more than just plants and soil. It was resilience, patience, and a symbol of the peace I'd found within myself. Evelyn may have tried to sabotage it, but she'd only made it stronger, and as I watered my flowers in the warm Georgia sun, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the garden would thrive long after she was just a memory. The garden wasn't perfect, it didn't need to be. But it was mine, and it was beautiful, in ways Evelyn could never have understood. And in that little haven of roses, tomatoes, and lavender, I finally found the peace I'd been searching for all along.